Lauren Ashford stood in the marble foyer of the Hargrave estate, her arms wrapped around two small bodies that trembled against her coat. Sophia pressed into her left side, Nathan into her right, both silent in that terrible way children become when fear steals their voices. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 9, each chime reverberating through the cavernous space like a death knell. 3 months had passed since the funeral. 3 months since they'd lowered Ryan into the frozen Montana ground, and Victoria Hargrave had finally decided to show her true face. The woman stood 15 feet away, backlit by the crystal chandelier that had cost more than most families earned in a year. At 63, Victoria maintained the kind of severity that wealth allowed. Silver hair pulled so tight it stretched the skin of her temples, a black Chanel dress that absorbed light rather than reflected it, and eyes the color of winter ice. Her son Derek flanked her right side, 35 years of privilege condensed into an Armani suit and a smile that had never reached his eyes. On her left stood Silas Whitmore, the family attorney, a man whose wire-rimmed glasses caught the chandelier light in a way that made his gaze disappear completely. 20 minutes. That's what Victoria had given her. 20 minutes to gather whatever she could carry and remove herself and Ryan's children from the only home they'd known since the twins were born. "You trapped my son with those children." Victoria's voice carried the kind of cold precision that came from decades of wielding power over people who couldn't fight back. "You wormed your way into this family with your tears and your poverty and your manipulation. Gold-digging little parasite. Now that Ryan is gone, you have no place here." The words landed like physical blows, each one designed to wound, to diminish, to erase. Lauren felt her spine straighten, despite the exhaustion that had become her constant companion since the accident. Since the moment 2 state troopers had appeared at her door with faces that told her everything before they'd spoken a word. Since she'd identified Ryan's body in the county morgue, his face peaceful despite the violence of the car's plunge off Route 12. "Victoria, please." Her own voice sounded thin, desperate even to her own ears. "The children just lost their father. They need family. They need stability. They need nothing from a woman like you." Victoria's interruption was surgical, cutting through Lauren's plea with practiced efficiency. "Derek, give her the money." Derek stepped forward, one hand sliding into his jacket pocket to produce a single $20 bill. He held it out between 2 fingers, as though the paper itself might contaminate him. A gesture so deliberately insulting that Lauren felt heat rise in her chest despite the November cold seeping through the estate's tall windows. "Mother is being generous," he said, his voice carrying the same aristocratic drawl that Ryan had worked so hard to shed. "Take this before we call the sheriff and have you removed for trespassing. You might also want to consider that we have evidence of theft. Small items, jewelry, valuables that have gone missing since you moved in. We've been very patient, given the circumstances, but our patience has limits." The lie was so brazen, so calculated, that Lauren actually gasped. She'd never taken anything, never even entered the parts of the house that Victoria considered her private domain. But she understood immediately what Derek was doing. Establishing a narrative, creating a story that would justify whatever came next. Silas Whitmore cleared his throat, the sound dry and rattling in the vast space. He produced a folder thick with documents, flipping it open to reveal page after page of dense legal text. "Mrs. Ashford, or should I say Miss Carter, as you'll need to return to your maiden name, you have no legal claim to this estate." His voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone who'd spent a lifetime insulating the wealthy from consequences. "Your husband's will, executed 2 years ago before these children were born, leaves everything to his mother. While normally a spouse would have certain rights, We have reason to believe the marriage may not have been entirely legal due to certain discrepancies in the original paperwork. Another lie, more elaborate this time. Lauren had seen their marriage license, had the certificate in a box somewhere in the bedroom she'd shared with Ryan. But she understood with sudden, terrible clarity that they'd been planning this, probably since the moment Ryan's coffin had been sealed, probably longer. She looked down at Sophia and Nathan, their faces turned up toward hers with eyes that held too much understanding for 4-year-olds. They'd lost their father to a car accident that the police had called mechanical failure, a tragedy of worn brake lines and bad timing on a steep mountain road. Now they were losing their home, their grandmother, their uncle, everyone who shared their blood besides the mother these people were trying to paint as a criminal and an outsider. Lauren made a decision in that moment, one that would define everything that came after. She would not beg these people, would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break completely in their marble foyer under their crystal chandelier. She would not cry or plead or bargain with monsters who called children bastards and offered $20 in exchange for a home. "I need to pack," she said quietly. Victoria's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. 20 minutes, Mrs. Ashford, not 21. The bedroom she'd shared with Ryan felt like a museum of a life that had ended too soon. His clothes still hung in the closet. His books still lined the shelves. His reading glasses still sat on the nightstand where he'd left them the morning he died. Lauren pulled the battered suitcase from the closet, the same one she'd brought when she'd moved in 5 years ago, back when Ryan had carried her over the threshold and Victoria had watched with barely concealed contempt, and threw clothes into it without thought or care. Sophia's favorite stuffed rabbit, Nathan's toy truck, 2 shirts that had been Ryan's, still carrying the faint scent of his cologne, jeans and sweaters, and whatever else her hands found in the chaos of drawers and hangers. 15 minutes later, she descended the grand staircase for the last time. Derek stood at the bottom with the $20 bill extended, and Lauren took it because she had exactly $847 in her checking account, and winter was coming to Montana, and pride couldn't feed children. The massive iron gates of the Hargrave estate began closing before she'd even reached the road, Derek operating them with a remote control from the warmth of the house. The metallic clang of their meeting echoed across the valley, final and absolute. Lauren stood on the empty country road with her broken suitcase, her $20, her 2 children, and nothing else. No car, that had been Ryan's, and therefore the estate's. No phone. The family plan had been canceled that afternoon. No plan beyond the immediate need to get somewhere warm before the temperature dropped further. The walk from the estate into Clearwater took nearly 3 hours. Sophia rode on Lauren's hip for the first hour, then Nathan for the second, then Sophia again as they traded back and forth, neither child complaining despite the cold that turned their breath to visible puffs in the darkness. The suitcase's broken wheel scraped and bumped over the uneven pavement, creating a rhythm that matched Lauren's footsteps and became a kind of meditation against the despair that threatened to overwhelm her. Downtown Clearwater consisted of a single street of brick buildings that had probably been charming in another era, but now looked tired and worn. Most of the shops were dark, their windows reflecting Lauren's bedraggled form as she passed. But at the corner of Main and Pine, a neon sign flickered in red and blue. Stone Mill Diner, open 24 hours. The bell above the door chimed as Lauren pushed inside, and the wave of heat that hit her face was so overwhelming she actually stumbled. Emma's small hand clutched her mother's worn jeans, while Nathan pressed closer to her leg, both children sensing the danger in this transition from cold to warmth, from walking to stopping, from movement to the terrible stillness of having nowhere left to go. The woman behind the counter looked up from the coffee pot she'd been refilling, and her expression shifted in an instant from professional pleasantness to something deeper, more human. She was perhaps 55, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize desperation when it walked through her door at 11 o'clock on a November night. "Honey," she said, already moving around the counter with the kind of efficiency that came from decades of waitressing. "You look like you've walked through hell itself." Lauren wanted to answer, tried to form words, but what came out was a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. The woman, her name tag read Hazel Winters, gently extracted Sophia from Lauren's arms, settling the child into a booth with practiced ease before guiding Nathan in beside his sister. Within minutes, steaming mugs of hot chocolate appeared, followed by plates of scrambled eggs and toast that the children attacked with the single-minded focus of exhaustion and hunger. Hazel returned with coffee for Lauren, the cup appearing in front of her like a benediction. "The food's on the house."
And before you start with the pride talk, I've been where you are. Different circumstances, maybe, but I know that look. That's the look of someone who needs a win, however small. The other customers, 2 truck drivers nursing coffee at the counter, glanced over briefly before returning to their phones, granting the kind of privacy that came from their own familiarity with hard times. When the diner emptied completely around midnight, Hazel locked the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and led Lauren and the twins through the kitchen to a storage room that smelled of flour and cardboard. "It's not much," Hazel said, pulling down flattened boxes and arranging them on the floor before spreading clean kitchen towels over them as makeshift blankets. "But it's warm, and it's safe, and sometimes that's enough."
Lauren wanted to thank her, wanted to express the profound gratitude that threatened to overwhelm her, but all she could manage was a nod as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. She lay down on the cardboard with Sophia on one side and Nathan on the other, their small, warm bodies pressed against hers, and in the darkness of that storage room, surrounded by the smell of old grease and dish soap, she let herself remember what she'd lost. 6 months ago, she'd had everything. A husband who loved her with a quiet intensity that had made her believe in fairy tales despite losing her parents at 19. A beautiful home that she'd never quite felt comfortable in, but had tried to make her own. Twin children who were healthy and happy and growing like weeds. A future that seemed bright and certain despite Victoria's constant criticism and Derek's barely concealed resentment. Ryan had been her anchor after her parents died in the car accident that had shattered her sophomore year of college. She'd met him 2 years later, working 3 jobs to pay for classes she could barely attend, serving coffee at a shop near the engineering firm where he worked. He'd been the customer who always left a $20 tip, the shy man with kind eyes who'd finally worked up the courage to ask her to dinner, the person who'd cried with her when the twins were born and held her hand through every moment of new parenthood chaos. The car accident had been sudden and brutal. Ryan's vehicle losing control on Route 12, the steep mountain road he drove every Tuesday evening coming home from work. Police calling it mechanical failure, brake lines that had deteriorated beyond safe function, a tragedy that no one could have prevented. Lauren had accepted that explanation because she'd had no reason not to, because she'd been drowning in grief and shock and the impossible task of explaining to 4-year-olds why Daddy wasn't coming home ever again. She'd thought his family would rally around her and the children, thought the shared grief would bind them together. But Victoria and Derek had turned cold almost immediately, their questions about Ryan's finances starting within days of the funeral, their treatment of her shifting from distant to hostile as the weeks passed. Now, lying on cardboard in a diner storage room, Lauren understood that she'd never really been part of the Hargrave family at all. They'd tolerated her only because of Ryan, and without him she was nothing to them. Disposable, easily discarded, worth exactly $20. Morning light filtered through the small window when Hazel appeared with fresh coffee and a bag of day-old donuts that the twins devoured while Lauren forced herself to think beyond the immediate moment. She had to call someone, had to find help, had to do something besides accept defeat in a storage room. The list of people she could turn to was devastatingly short. Her parents were 15 years dead. Ryan's family had just thrown her into the street.
She had no siblings, no aunts or uncles, no extended family network to fall back on. But there was one name that surfaced from the depths of memory. One person who'd been there during the worst period of her life before Ryan. Maeve Calloway had been her roommate during those 2 years of college before her parents died. The friend who'd held her through the nights of crying, who'd helped her pack up her dorm room when she'd had to drop out, who'd promised to stay in touch even as their lives diverged. They'd exchanged Christmas cards for a few years, but Lauren had been so consumed by marriage and motherhood that she'd let the friendship fade into occasional social media likes and birthday messages. Hazel's rotary phone hung on the wall beside the walk-in freezer, a relic from another era that still worked despite its age. Lauren's hands shook as she dialed the number she'd found in the phone book, listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times, her heart sinking with each unanswered tone. Then, "Hello?" The voice was familiar even after 5 years, carrying that same note of breathless energy that Maeve had always projected. "Maeve, it's Lauren. Lauren Carter. Lauren Ashford. We were roommates back at university." The words tumbled out in a rush, desperation making her voice crack. "I know this is crazy. I know we haven't talked in years, but I'm in trouble. Real trouble. And I have nowhere else to turn." The pause lasted only a heartbeat before Maeve's response came strong and immediate. "Lauren! Oh my God, of course I remember you. Where are you? What's happened? Are you safe?" Lauren explained everything in a tumble of words. Ryan's death, the exile from the estate, the night walking through the cold with her children. Maeve listened without interrupting, and when Lauren finished, her friend's voice came back with the kind of certainty that felt like a lifeline. "Get yourself to Missoula. I'm at 847 Pine Street, apartment 6C. Come now, today. You and the babies are staying with me, and we'll figure everything else out later." 2 hours later, Lauren and the twins stood at the Clearwater bus station with tickets to Missoula that Hazel had paid for with her own money, refusing Lauren's tearful promises to pay her back with a fierce hug and a whispered reminder that kindness wasn't a debt. It was a gift that kept moving forward. The bus ride through Montana was a journey through a landscape so vast and indifferent that it made Lauren feel smaller than she ever had. Mountains rose on either side of the highway like ancient sentinels, their peaks already dusted with snow that promised a brutal winter ahead. Pine forests stretched to the horizon, broken only by occasional clearings where houses sat isolated against the wilderness. Emma and Nathan pressed their faces to the window, their breath fogging the glass as they watched the endless scenery roll past, and Lauren told them stories to keep their minds occupied. Fairy tales about brave children who faced giants and wolves, about lost princes who found their way home, about magic that came when you needed it most. She made her voice cheerful and bright, animated the stories with gestures and funny voices, all while her own mind spiraled with terror about what came next. How would she feed her children beyond today? How would she ever recover from this free fall into poverty? The $20 in her pocket felt like a sick joke, a final insult from people who'd made their contempt brutally clear. The other passengers on the bus, mostly working people heading to the city for jobs or errands, occasionally glanced at the young mother with her 2 small children and her battered suitcase. Lauren wondered what stories they imagined about her, whether they saw a woman fleeing abuse or a drifter moving from town to town, or whether they simply saw her as invisible, another struggling soul in a world full of them.
Missoula's small bus terminal materialized as the afternoon light began to fade, and Lauren gathered her children and her single bag with the kind of exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into something spiritual. But she also felt that tiny spark of hope she hadn't allowed herself since Victoria had pronounced sentence in the marble foyer. The hope that maybe, just maybe, she and her children would survive this after all. Maeve's apartment building stood on a side street that had seen better decades. Its brick facade weathered and stained. Narrow hallway painted a dingy beige that spoke of landlords who did the bare minimum. The smell of cooking oil and cigarette smoke hung in the air, mixing with the sharper scent of cleaning products and old carpet. But when Maeve opened the door to 6C and pulled Lauren into a fierce hug, it felt like stepping into sanctuary. The apartment itself was tiny. A single bedroom barely large enough for a double bed, a living room that could fit a worn couch and a television on a plastic stand, a kitchenette with appliances that had been white decades ago and were now a sad yellowed cream, and a bathroom so small you had to step out to turn around. But Maeve had made it home with bright curtains on the windows, plants on every available surface, and photographs covering one wall in a cheerful collage of memories. "It's not much," Maeve said, her dark eyes warm as she ushered them inside. "But it's warm and safe, and yours for as long as you need it." She looked exactly as Lauren remembered, perhaps a little thinner, with new lines around her eyes that spoke of exhaustion and stress, but still radiating that same fierce energy that had made her such a force in college. Over the next few days, Lauren learned the full scope of her friend's circumstances and felt her gratitude deepen into something close to awe. Maeve worked 2 jobs, her main position as a nurse at St. Patrick Hospital on 12-hour night shifts, and a second job 3 days a week at an urgent care clinic. She slept in fragmented chunks between shifts, surviving on coffee and determination. She'd been divorced for 8 months, her ex-husband having left her for a younger woman and stuck her with most of their shared debt. The small apartment was all she could afford while paying down credit cards and trying to rebuild her life. When Lauren offered to pay rent, to contribute something, anything from the $20 she still had clutched in her pocket, Maeve had actually laughed, a sound both bitter and warm. "Lauren, honey, you focus on those babies and getting back on your feet. I'm not taking money from a woman who has nothing. That's not how this works. We're friends, and friends help each other. Period." The matter-of-fact way she said it, the absolute refusal to accept any payment, made Lauren realize that Maeve's generosity wasn't coming from abundance, but from sacrifice. Every day Lauren and the twins stayed here meant Maeve was stretching her already thin resources even thinner. Eating less so the children could eat more, giving up her bedroom so they could have privacy while she slept on the couch. Sophia and Nathan began to adjust to their new reality with the resilience of children who had no choice but to adapt. They learned to play quietly in the small living room, building towers from Maeve's nursing textbooks, and creating elaborate imaginary worlds with their 2 stuffed animals and whatever household items they could repurpose. Maeve bought them a box of crayons and a coloring book from the dollar store, and they spent hours sprawled on the worn carpet, their small faces serious with concentration as they filled in the lines with intense focus. But Lauren saw the trauma lurking beneath their careful adjustment. Saw it in the way Sophia would sometimes stop mid-play and stare out the window with eyes too old for her face, as though searching for something she'd lost and couldn't name. Saw it in the way Nathan would wake screaming from nightmares about dark roads and cold gates, his small body shaking with terror until Lauren held him close and whispered reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. The worst moments came when they asked questions delivered with the innocent directness of 4-year-olds, who didn't understand why their world had been torn apart. One evening, as Lauren tucked them into the makeshift bed on Maeve's floor, Nathan looked up with blue eyes so heartbreakingly like Ryan's that Lauren felt her breath catch.
Mommy, when is Daddy coming home?
The question landed like a physical blow, despite knowing it would come eventually, despite preparing herself for this moment 100 times. Lauren knelt beside the bed, pulling both children close, feeling their small, warm bodies against hers. Daddy's not coming home, sweetheart. Remember, Daddy went to heaven. He's watching over us, but he can't come back.
Nathan nodded slowly, processing this with the solemnity of childhood grief, before asking in a smaller voice,
Can we go back to our big house? The one with my room with the race car bed? Sophia, lying beside her brother, added her own plea with devastating simplicity. And my princess room. And Grandma Victoria.
Why doesn't she love us anymore, Mommy? What did we do wrong?
The question broke something in Lauren's chest. The casual cruelty of Victoria's rejection rendered even more terrible by its impact on children too young to understand that adult malice had nothing to do with their worth. She pulled them both close, one arm around each small body, and struggled to find words that would give them truth without destroying them. You didn't do anything wrong, babies. Nothing at all.
Sometimes grown-ups make bad choices that hurt the people they should protect.
Grandma Victoria made a bad choice, but that's not your fault. You are perfect and loved, and we're going to be okay. But as she held them and felt them finally relax into sleep, Lauren stared at the water-stained ceiling of Maeve's tiny apartment and wondered if she was lying to them. If a mother's love could possibly be enough to heal the wounds that had been carved into their young hearts by loss and cruelty and the sudden violent poverty that had become their new reality. The job search began on Lauren's third day in Missoula, when she could no longer stand the weight of being a burden. She sat at Maeve's tiny kitchen table with the newspaper classified section spread before her, a pen in her hand, and a sinking feeling in her chest as she confronted the reality of her situation. Her resume was a disaster, showing a 3-year gap that screamed to potential employers exactly what she was: a stay-at-home mother with no recent work experience, no references from the last half-decade, and skills that had atrophied from disuse. Before the twins were born, she'd worked as a mechanical engineer at a firm in Seattle, designing components for industrial machinery. But that felt like another lifetime, another person. Day after day, Lauren walked the streets of Missoula with application forms clutched in her cold hands, pushing through the doors of offices and restaurants and retail stores, smiling her most professional smile and trying to project competence and reliability, while knowing that her worn thrift store clothes and desperate eyes told a different story. The rejections came in various forms. Some employers flat out told her they needed someone with current experience. Others took her application with polite smiles and promises to call. Promises she knew were empty the moment they glanced at the gap in her employment history. One office manager, a thin woman with sharp eyes and sharper words, had asked her point blank why she'd stopped working. And when Lauren explained about her children, the woman's expression had shifted to something between pity and dismissal. We really need someone who can commit to unpredictable hours. Someone without childcare constraints. After 2 weeks of searching, of walking until her feet ached and facing rejection after rejection, Lauren finally found a lifeline at Morrison's Grocery, a large chain supermarket on the edge of town, where the manager seemed less interested in her resume than in her willingness to work. Garrett Hayes was 48, with tired eyes and sun-weathered skin, a man who'd probably seen enough desperate people to recognize one more wouldn't make much difference to his bottom line. The job he offered was stocking shelves from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, minimum wage at $7.25 an hour, no benefits for the first 6 months, physically demanding work that would leave her exhausted. But it was employment. It was money. and Lauren accepted it with a gratitude that seemed to surprise him. The logistics were challenging but manageable only because of Maeve's impossible generosity. Maeve worked nights at the hospital, leaving at 10 and returning at 7, which meant she could watch Sophia and Nathan while Lauren worked. The two women traded shifts in the small apartment like sailors on a watch, passing each other in the hallway with tired smiles and whispered updates about the children's meals and moods and small triumphs. Lauren's first night at Morrison's was a baptism in humility, her back screaming as she hauled boxes and arranged cans on shelves that stretched endlessly under harsh fluorescent lights. Her hands grew raw from cardboard cuts. Her shoulders ached from reaching and lifting, and by the time her shift ended at 7, she could barely stand. But when she received her first paycheck 2 weeks later, a pathetically small amount after taxes that worked out to $487, she held it like it was gold, because it meant she was fighting back, taking control, refusing to be defeated by the cruel hand fate had dealt her. It was on a quiet Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after arriving in Missoula, when Lauren finally forced herself to properly unpack the battered suitcase that had been sitting in the corner of Maeve's living room, its contents still jumbled exactly as she'd thrown them together during those desperate 20 minutes at the Hargrave estate. Maeve was at work, and the twins were napping on the makeshift bed in the bedroom. Lauren knelt beside the suitcase and began pulling out wrinkled shirts and jeans, setting them in neat piles for the small dresser Maeve had cleared for her. The clothes still carried the faint scent of Ryan's cologne, that familiar mixture of cedar and something citrus that made her throat tighten with grief. Her fingers brushed against something she didn't remember packing, a cream-colored envelope wedged between 2 folded sweaters at the bottom of the case. She pulled it out, confused, and saw that it was addressed in Ryan's distinctive handwriting, the careful block letters he'd always used for anything important. For Sophia and Nathan, your 4th birthday. Lauren's breath caught. Their 4th birthday was still 5 months away. Ryan had been dead for nearly 4 months, which meant he'd written this at least 9 months ago, probably longer, planning ahead for a milestone he wouldn't be alive to see. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope and found a cheerful card with cartoon balloons on the front. Inside, Ryan had written a message to the twins in his careful script, telling them how much he loved them, how proud he was to be their father, how he hoped they would grow up brave and kind and curious about the world. Lauren's tears fell onto the card as she read his words, hearing his voice in her mind, feeling the loss of him like a fresh wound tearing open. But it was what she found on the back of the card that made the world tilt sideways and her heart begin to hammer against her ribs. In smaller, more hurried handwriting, as if written quickly and under stress, Ryan had penned a message directly to her. Lauren, if you're reading this, something has happened. Box 447, First National Bank, Billings. Password, Sophia Nathan 2020. Trust no one from the Hargrave family. She read it once, her mind refusing to process the words. Read it again. And a third time, each reading making her hands shake harder as the implications crashed over her in waves. Ryan had known something was wrong, had anticipated danger, had hidden something important enough that he'd felt the need to leave her this cryptic message. And he'd specifically warned her not to trust his family, the same family that had thrown her and her children into the street. Flashbacks began flooding her memory. Details she'd filed away as insignificant but now seemed laden with terrible meaning. Ryan had been distracted in those final 6 weeks, coming home late from work with tension in his shoulders that she'd attributed to job stress. He'd taken phone calls in the garage where she couldn't hear the conversations, his voice low and urgent through the walls. He'd insisted they update their wills, a conversation that had seemed morbid and unnecessary to Lauren, who'd laughed nervously and said they were too young to worry about such things. But Ryan had been serious, almost urgent, saying that parents needed to be responsible, needed to plan for the worst even while hoping for the best.
She'd sign the documents he'd prepared without reading them carefully, trusting him as she'd always trusted him with financial and legal matters, because Ryan was the organized one, the planner, the person who handled all the complicated adult responsibilities while she focused on keeping two toddlers alive and relatively happy. Now she wondered what those documents had actually said, whether they'd contained provisions or protections she'd never noticed, and she cursed herself for being so passive, so willing to let him manage everything without question. There had been other signs too, she realized with dawning horror. Ryan had opened a new bank account that he'd mentioned only in passing, saying something vague about wanting to keep some business funds separate. He'd spent a Saturday afternoon taking photographs of documents spread across their dining room table, and when she'd asked what he was doing, he'd smiled and said he was just organizing paperwork, nothing important. He'd asked her once, out of nowhere while they were washing dishes together, if she remembered his grandfather on his mother's side, the one who died before they met. When she'd said she only knew what he'd told her, that the man had been some kind of engineer, Ryan had nodded slowly and said the man was more than that he was brilliant and never got the credit he deserved. At the time, she'd thought it was just Ryan being sentimental, honoring a grandparent's memory. But now those words echoed with potential significance, as if Ryan had been trying to tell her something without quite saying it outright, planting seeds of information that would bloom only after his death. Lauren sat frozen on the floor of Maeve's apartment, staring at Ryan's note, and felt the foundations of everything she thought she knew about his death begin to crack and shift beneath her. Car accidents were supposed to be random tragedies, not events that required secret safety deposit boxes and warnings about family betrayal. The mechanical failure that the police had cited seemed less like an explanation now and more like a cover for something far darker and more deliberate. That night, Lauren lay on the floor beside the twins' makeshift bed, staring at the ceiling while Maeve's soft snoring drifted from the couch in the living room, and her mind raced through memories she'd filed away as insignificant but now seemed crucial. She tried to remember the weeks before the accident, searching for clues in the fog of exhaustion that had defined those early years of parenting twins. Details began to surface like debris floating up from a shipwreck. Ryan had been even more distracted than usual in those final weeks, sitting at his computer late into the night, with a tension in his shoulders that spoke of stress beyond normal work pressures. He'd insisted they get copies of all their important documents, birth certificates, social security cards, insurance policies, and store them in a fireproof box he'd purchased specifically for that purpose. He'd updated the beneficiaries on his life insurance policy, or at least he'd told her he had, making sure everything was in order just in case. She remembered thinking at the time that he was being overly cautious, maybe even a little paranoid. But she'd indulged him because that was what you did when you loved someone. You humored their quirks and accepted their need for control over the uncontrollable chaos of life. Now she wondered if paranoia was the right word, or if Ryan had simply been prudent in the face of threats she hadn't seen because she'd been too busy changing diapers and preventing toddlers from killing themselves with household objects. The morning brought no clarity, only the exhausted certainty that Lauren needed to act. She waited until Maeve returned from her hospital shift, looking as tired as Lauren felt, and explained everything while her friend made coffee with hands that shook slightly from lack of sleep. Lauren showed her the envelope, Ryan's note, the cryptic message about the safety deposit box. Maeve read it twice, her expression shifting from confusion to concern to something that looked like fierce protective anger. "You have to go," she said simply, no hesitation in her voice. "Obviously you have to go. And I'll take a personal day to watch Sophia and Nathan. God knows the hospital owes me about 17 days off at this point." Lauren tried to protest, to explain that she couldn't keep taking from Maeve's already depleted resources,
but her friend cut her off with a tired smile that held no room for argument. "This is what friends do, Lauren. And besides, something in my gut tells me this is important. Ryan wouldn't have left you that note if it wasn't crucial."
Whatever's in that box, you need to see it. The lie to Garrett Hayes was harder. Required Lauren to fabricate a story about a sick aunt in Billings who needed her help for the day. She delivered it with as much sincerity as she could muster, watching his skeptical expression and knowing he didn't quite believe her, but was willing to let it slide this once. The unspoken threat hung in the air between them. This one time, but don't make it a habit or you're gone. The bus ticket cost $28, money Lauren couldn't really afford to spend, and she packed a small bag with Ryan's note, his death certificate that she'd managed to keep despite Victoria's attempts to confiscate all his documents, their marriage license, and whatever else she thought might prove her identity and her right to access whatever Ryan had hidden in the mysterious box. The bus to Billings departed Missoula at 6 in the morning, when the winter darkness still pressed against the windows and the few passengers were silent and half asleep in their seats. Lauren sat near the back, her small bag clutched on her lap, her mind racing through 1,000 scenarios of what might happen when she reached the bank. She rehearsed her explanation over and over, trying different approaches, imagining herself standing before a skeptical banker and saying, "Her husband left me this note before he died. I need to access his safety deposit box." And each version sounded more desperate and less credible than the last. What if they didn't believe her? What if Ryan's note wasn't enough authorization? What if there were legal procedures she didn't understand that would prevent her from accessing whatever he'd hidden? And worst of all, what if she made this journey, spent money she couldn't afford, risked her job, and found nothing but old tax documents and expired warranties? As the bus climbed into the mountains and descended again into the broad valley where Billings spread across the landscape, Lauren pressed her forehead against the cold window and tried to calm her racing heart by focusing on the simple fact that Ryan had trusted her with this information, had believed she would find the note and understand its importance. And that faith had to mean something, even if she couldn't yet see what. The bus pulled into Billings Station at 9:15, and Lauren made her way through unfamiliar downtown streets, following directions she'd carefully written on a scrap of paper the night before. First National Bank rose 4 stories in gray stone that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome, its brass fixtures gleaming in the cold sunlight, and its marble lobby beyond the heavy doors vast enough to swallow sound and hope in equal measure. Lauren became acutely aware of her thrift store coat with its missing button, her worn shoes with the scuff mark she couldn't quite buff away, the way she looked like someone who didn't belong in a place where money was serious business, conducted by serious people. The information desk directed her to the safe deposit department on the 2nd floor, and she climbed the wide staircase with Ryan's documents clutched in hands that wouldn't stop trembling no matter how many deep breaths she took. The woman behind the desk in the vault antechamber was perhaps 56, with graying hair pulled into a professional bun, and eyes that assessed Lauren with the kind of practiced neutrality that came from years of dealing with people in crisis. Her nameplate read Elspeth Granger, Senior Vault Manager, and something in her expression suggested she'd seen every variation of human desperation walk through her door. Lauren approached the desk and began her rehearsed explanation, her voice shaking slightly as the words tumbled out. "My husband, Ryan Ashford, died 4 months ago. He left me this note with instructions to access box 447. I have his death certificate and our marriage license to prove who I am." She spread the documents across Elspeth's desk, like playing cards in a game where she didn't know the rules. Ryan's note with its urgent scrawl, the official death certificate with its clinical description of mechanical failure and blunt force trauma, the marriage license from King County, Washington that proved they'd been legally joined 5 years ago
in a courthouse ceremony because Victoria had refused to host a proper wedding. Elspeth took the documents without speaking, examining each one with the careful attention of someone trained to spot forgeries and inconsistencies. Her eyes moved from the death certificate to the marriage license to Ryan's handwritten note, cross-referencing dates and signatures with something on her computer screen that Lauren couldn't see.
The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Each second an agony of waiting while Lauren's future hung in the balance of this stranger's professional judgment. Finally, Elspeth looked up and met Lauren's eyes with an expression that had softened almost imperceptibly from neutral assessment to something approaching compassion. "Everything appears to be in order, Mrs. Ashford. Your husband did indeed rent this box, and while the account is in his name, your documentation, combined with his explicit instructions in this note, gives you access under our policies for deceased account holders. Let me verify the details and we'll proceed." She disappeared into a back office for another 15 minutes that Lauren spent trying to keep her breathing steady and her hope from spiraling into either crushing disappointment or dangerous optimism. When Elspeth returned, she held 2 keys and a small smile that suggested she understood more about Lauren's situation than professional protocol would allow her to acknowledge. The vault itself was exactly what Lauren had imagined from movies and television. A cavernous room lined floor to ceiling with brass-fronted boxes of varying sizes, the air slightly cooler than the rest of the building and carrying that peculiar metallic smell of old money and older secrets. Elspeth led her to a section in the far corner and used both keys, her master and one that had apparently been on file with Ryan's account information, to open the designated compartment, which turned out to be one of the larger sizes, roughly the dimensions of a briefcase rather than the small rectangular slots Lauren had pictured. She pulled the long metal container from its slot and carried it to a small private room off the main vault, a windowless space with nothing but a table and 2 chairs designed to give clients privacy as they examined whatever valuables or documents they'd chosen to hide from the world. Elspeth set it on the table with a gentleness that felt almost ceremonial. "Take all the time you need, Mrs. Ashford." The words carried a weight that suggested Elspeth sensed the gravity of whatever was about to unfold. Then she stepped out and closed the door, leaving Lauren alone with her dead husband's final secret. The container was heavier than it looked, and Lauren's hands shook so violently as she lifted the lid that she had to set it back down and take 3 deep breaths before trying again. Inside, arranged with the kind of careful precision that had characterized everything Ryan did, were 3 items that would shatter and rebuild her understanding of the last 4 months in the space of the next hour. On top lay a thick document bound with blue legal backing, the kind of official paperwork that spoke of lawyers and notaries and binding contracts. Beneath it was a sealed envelope with her name written across the front in Ryan's distinctive handwriting. The letters slightly larger than his usual script, as though he'd wanted to make absolutely certain she'd recognize it was meant for her. And at the bottom, cushioned in protective foam, sat a small black USB drive in a hard case that had been designed to survive water, impact, and time. Lauren picked up the legal document first, her engineering background helping her parse the dense language, even as her hands continued their trembling. The title alone made her breath catch. Irrevocable Trust Agreement and Patent Assignment. It was dated August 15th, exactly 2 months before Ryan's death, and as she worked through the complicated clauses and legal terminology, the scope of what she was reading began to register in waves of shock that left her feeling physically unsteady. The document explained that Ryan Michael Ashford had inherited upon reaching his 30th birthday, which had been 2 years ago, she realized with a jolt, full rights to United States patent number 8,945,673, titled Advanced Photovoltaic Energy Conversion System with Integrated Storage Mechanism. The patent had been invented and filed by Walter Brennan, Ryan's maternal grandfather,
a man Lauren had never met because he died in 1984, 16 years before she was born. Walter had been an electrical engineer who'd spent his career working for various companies while pursuing his own research on the side, driven by a conviction that solar energy represented humanity's future, if only the technology could be made efficient and practical. In 1980, according to the document, he'd achieved a breakthrough, a revolutionary system that didn't just convert solar energy to electricity, but stored it using precision mechanical components, gears and flywheels and bearings calibrated to tolerances that were nearly impossible to achieve with 1980s manufacturing technology. He'd filed for the patent in 1980, but the invention had languished for decades because the technology was so far ahead of its time that nobody took it seriously. Fossil fuels were cheap. Solar panels were expensive jokes. And Walter's claims about mechanical energy storage seemed like the fever dreams of an eccentric inventor. The patent had gone dormant, generating no licensing fees, attracting no commercial interest, forgotten by everyone except Walter himself. But the green energy revolution of the 2010s and 2020s had changed everything. As solar technology improved and the world's desperate need for renewable energy became undeniable, companies had begun searching through old patents for solutions to the storage problem that plagued modern solar installations. And they'd found Walter Brennan's 1980 patent, which turned out to be not the ravings of a madman, but a legitimate engineering marvel that had simply been born 40 years too early. 17 major renewable energy companies had licensed the technology in the last 5 years alone. The document listed them all, familiar names like SunPower and First Solar, alongside smaller startups that Lauren had never heard of, and detailed the royalty payments that flowed from each license. The numbers made her vision blur, and her hands shake even harder as her mind tried to process figures that seemed to belong in a different reality than the one where she'd spent last night sleeping on a floor in a friend's apartment. Annual royalties from all 17 licenses combined, $8 to $12 million, depending on production volumes and market conditions. Conservative assessed current value of the patent and its associated licensing agreements over the remaining life of the patent. $100 million. Written both as a figure, $100 million, and spelled out in words to prevent any ambiguity or misunderstanding. $100 million. Lauren set the document down because her hands could no longer hold it steady, and she stared at the wall of the small examination room while her brain tried and failed to integrate this information with everything she knew about her life. Ryan had inherited a patent worth $100 million 2 years ago, and he'd never told her, never mentioned it, never gave any indication that their financial future was anything other than the comfortable middle-class existence they'd been living, with him working his engineering job and her staying home with the twins, and both of them occasionally worrying about whether they were saving enough for college and retirement. But the trust document explained why. Ryan had created this irrevocable trust immediately upon receiving the patent, naming 3 beneficiaries, and only 3. Lauren Elizabeth Ashford as primary beneficiary, Sophia Rose Ashford as secondary, and Nathan Ryan Ashford as secondary. The language was explicit and absolute, using legal phrasing that even Lauren's non-lawyer eyes could recognize as ironclad. These individuals, and only these individuals, shall have any claim to, benefit from, or right to assets contained within this trust. And then, in language that suddenly made Victoria's cruelty and Derek's threats crystallize into terrible clarity. Specifically, and without exception, this trust excludes any and all members of the Hargrave family by blood relation to the grantor. No Hargrave, whether by birth or marriage or any other connection, shall have any claim whatsoever to the assets, income, or benefits of this trust. Ryan had known. known that his family would come for the money, known they couldn't be trusted,
Known he had to protect his wife and children from people who shared his blood, but not his values. And he'd done it with the kind of methodical precision that had characterized everything about him, creating legal walls that even Victoria's expensive lawyers couldn't breach. The envelope with Lauren's name came next, and she tore it open with fingers that had gone numb from shock and the peculiar cold that came from sitting in a windowless room while your understanding of reality collapsed and rebuilt itself. The letter inside was several pages long, Ryan's careful handwriting filling each sheet with words that felt like hearing his voice one last time.
"My dearest Lauren," it began, and she had to stop reading after the first line to wipe tears from her eyes before they could fall and smudge the ink. "If you're reading this, my worst fears have come true, and I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you in person. I'm sorry I left you alone to face what's coming." He explained the whole story in the pages that followed, his words measured and clear, despite what must have been the terror of writing a letter you hoped would never be read. 6 weeks before his death, he'd received notification from the law firm managing Walter's estate that the trust period had ended and the patent was transferring to him as the designated heir. He'd had no idea what it was worth until the lawyers explained the licensing agreements and royalty streams and conservative valuations that put the total value somewhere north of $100 million. Ryan had been shocked, overwhelmed, and immediately suspicious. He'd grown up watching Victoria's obsession with money and status, had seen how she treated people who couldn't offer her social advancement or financial gain, had witnessed her particular brand of cruelty toward anyone she considered beneath the Hargrave standard. He'd known without question that if his family learned about the patent, they would claim it for themselves, would argue that Walter's work belonged to the family collective, would destroy anyone who stood in their way. So he'd created the trust immediately, working with attorneys Victoria didn't know to establish unbreakable legal protections for Lauren and the twins. He'd planned to tell her everything on their 4th birthday, wanting to surprise her with the news that their financial future was secure, that they could give their children every advantage while also honoring Walter's memory by funding renewable energy research with some of the money. But 3 weeks ago, and Lauren's heart clenched as she read the date, recognizing it as exactly 3 weeks before his death, Derek had cornered him at a family dinner and asked pointed questions about Walter's estate, about whether there had been any intellectual property transfers, about patents and licensing agreements. Ryan had played dumb, pretending ignorance, but Derek's questions had been too specific, too focused to be casual curiosity. "Lauren," the letter continued, and she could hear the fear in his written words. "I'm scared. Derek knows something. Maybe not everything, but enough to be dangerous. Yesterday he pulled me aside and said if I was hiding family assets, there would be consequences. He said accidents happen to people who don't cooperate with family interests. I recorded the conversation. It's on the USB drive along with other evidence I've been gathering. If something happens to me, you'll need proof of what they've done." The paragraph ended, and the next one began with words that would haunt Lauren for the rest of her life. "The trust is ironclad. They can't break it legally, but they might try to break you. They'll claim you're unfit. They'll try to take the kids. They'll destroy your reputation and your spirit if it means getting control of the money through Sophia and Nathan. Don't let them. You're the strongest person I know. Fight for our children. Use what Walter left us to protect them. I love you more than anything in this world. If I don't make it home, know that every moment with you was the best of my life." The letter was signed and dated October 20th, 3 days before his death, and included a postscript that Lauren read through tears that no longer felt like grief, but like rage. "Trust Van Thatcher." He was Grandpa Walter's best friend and apprentice.
If you need help understanding the patent or dealing with the Hargraves, find Van in Clearwater. He'll know what to do.
Lauren set the letter down and picked up the USB drive with hands that had stopped shaking and started feeling steady with purpose for the first time since Victoria had pronounced sentence in the marble foyer.
She asked Elspeth if there was a computer she could use, and the vault manager led her to a small office with an ancient desktop that looked like it had been purchased during the Clinton administration, but still functioned well enough to read files. The drive contained 6 audio files, each labeled with a date from September and early October, the weeks leading up to Ryan's death on October 23rd.
Lauren clicked on the first file and heard her husband's voice for the first time in 4 months. The sound of it hitting her like a physical blow that left her gasping.
The recording captured what sounded like a casual dinner conversation at the Hargrave estate.
Silverware clinking against china in the background, and multiple voices discussing weather and politics and nothing of consequence, until Derek's smooth baritone cut through the pleasantries with a question that seemed friendly on the surface, but carried an edge underneath.
"So Ryan, you turned 30 last year. Grandpa Walter's trust must have finally come through. What did the old man leave you? Besides that falling down estate in Clearwater that nobody wants?" Ryan's response was carefully neutral, his voice carrying none of the tension Lauren now knew he must have been feeling. "Just the property, Derek. A house I'll probably never use and some land that's not worth much." "Really? Because I did some digging into family history. Grandpa Walter filed several patents back in the 80s. Energy technology, solar conversion system. Surely those transferred to someone when he died. Intellectual property like that doesn't just disappear."
"If he did file patents, I don't know anything about them. The lawyers only mentioned the real estate." Derek's voice took on a sharper quality, the friendly veneer cracking just enough to reveal the calculation beneath. "Don't play dumb with me, cousin. That patent is family legacy.
Whatever Walter left should be shared with the whole family, not hoarded by one person who happened to be named in an old man's will." The first recording ended there, and Lauren sat in the small office feeling her understanding of the last 4 months continue its radical reconstruction. The second recording was dated a week later and featured Victoria's imperious voice demanding that Ryan acknowledge his obligation to family, her words dripping with the kind of entitled fury that Lauren had experienced firsthand when she'd been thrown out with $20 and 2 terrified children. The third recording showed Derek becoming more aggressive, his questions more specific as he described hiring an investigator who'd found patent number 8,945,673 and traced the licensing agreements worth millions annually. Ryan's denials sounded weaker in this recording, and Lauren could hear the stress in his voice as he tried to deflect his cousin's increasingly hostile interrogation. But it was the fourth recording that made Lauren's blood run cold, and her certainty crystallize into absolute knowledge of what had happened to Ryan on that mountain road. The audio quality was different, slightly muffled, as though Ryan had hidden his phone to record a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. Victoria and Derek were speaking in what they clearly believed was private, their voices carrying the casual certainty of people who'd grown accustomed to getting whatever they wanted through money and manipulation and force.
"He's not going to cooperate, Derek. He thinks he's morally superior, just like Father always did. Thinks family loyalty means something other than protecting our interests." Derek's response came after a pause that felt weighted with decision.
"Then we need to force his hand. File a lawsuit claiming Walter was mentally incompetent when he made the will. Contest the trust, tie it up in litigation for years."
"That could take a decade, and we might still lose. No, we need something more permanent, more final." Another pause, longer this time. And when Derek spoke again, his voice had dropped to something that might have been horror or might have been calculation.
What exactly are you suggesting, Mother? Victoria's answer came with the kind of cold clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. I'm suggesting that accidents happen. Young men drive recklessly on mountain roads. Brake failures are tragic, but they occur, especially on vehicles that haven't been properly maintained. And when Ryan is gone, that wife of his will crumble. She's nobody, has no resources, no family, no ability to fight us. We'll contest everything, claim she's unfit, take custody of those children. They're Hargraves by blood. They belong with us, and the money comes with them. The fifth recording captured Derek on the phone with someone Lauren didn't recognize. His voice matter-of-fact as he discussed payment and logistics and timing. The car needs to be prepared. He drives Route 12 every Tuesday evening coming home from work. That's the steep section with 15 miles of switchbacks. The brake line needs to fail on the descent. Make it look like wear and tear, not sabotage. I'm paying you $50,000 cash, half now and half when it's done. Nobody can ever know about this. The unknown voice on the other end asked a question Lauren couldn't make out, and Derek's response was chilling in its casual dismissal of blood and morality. He's an obstacle to what my family deserves. Obstacles get removed. Just make sure it looks like an accident. The sixth and final recording was dated October 15th, 8 days before Ryan died, and featured Victoria laying out their plan with the kind of detail that made it clear this was calculated murder rather than momentary rage. She'd already drafted documents claiming Lauren's marriage was fraudulent, had found supposed irregularities in the paperwork that could be used to challenge the legitimacy of the union, and therefore the children's inheritance rights. She planned to bury Lauren in litigation, use custody threats to break her spirit, contest the trust through every legal avenue while simultaneously destroying any ability Lauren might have to fight back. The $100 million stays in the Hargrave family where it belongs, Victoria concluded, her voice carrying absolute certainty that her plan would succeed because it always had before. Because money and power and ruthlessness had never failed her yet. Lauren sat in the small office staring at the computer screen long after the final recording had ended, and she understood with perfect clarity that Ryan had been murdered. Not killed in a random accident, but deliberately targeted and executed by his own family for money he'd tried to protect, for a future he'd wanted to secure for his wife and children. The mechanical failure the police had cited wasn't tragic circumstance, but careful sabotage. The exile from the estate wasn't grief-driven cruelty, but strategic positioning. Derek's threats at Morrison's weren't desperate intimidation, but part of a larger plan to steal everything while painting Lauren as the villain. Elspeth knocked softly and entered to find Lauren with tears streaming down her face and fury radiating from every line of her body. The vault manager took one look at her expression and spoke with quiet certainty. Whatever you found in that container, Mrs. Ashford, it's serious. Life-changingly serious, and you need help. She pulled a business card from her desk and pressed it into Lauren's hand with the kind of decisive gesture that suggested she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. My sister, Rourke Sterling. She's a patent attorney who also handles criminal cases, and she works pro bono for women in crisis situations. I think you qualify. Elspeth made the call herself, speaking in low, urgent tones about a client who needed immediate help, about evidence that couldn't wait, about circumstances that demanded action now rather than later. She hung up and met Lauren's eyes with an expression that mixed professional distance with genuine concern. Rourke will see you in 1 hour. Her office is 2 blocks from here, 3rd floor of the Stockman building. Take everything from the container. Don't let it out of your sight. The Stockman building was exactly the kind of place where serious legal work happened. Solid brick construction from the early 20th century, brass railings on the stairs,
frosted glass doors with names etched in old-fashioned script. Rourke Sterling's office occupied a corner suite on the third floor, and the woman who opened the door at Lauren's knock looked nothing like what she'd expected. 52 years old with steel gray hair cut in a sharp bob, intelligent green eyes behind frameless glasses, and a tailored suit that spoke of success without ostentation, she radiated the kind of competence that came from decades of fighting battles and winning more than she lost. Lauren told her everything. Started with Ryan's death 4 months ago, and worked forward through the exile and the poverty and the discovery of the note, laying out each piece of evidence on Rourke's mahogany desk, like building a case from the ground up. The trust documents, Ryan's letter, the recordings, all of it spread across expensive wood under the attorney's sharp gaze. Rourke listened without interrupting, making notes in a legal pad with quick, efficient strokes, her expression growing progressively graver as the story unfolded. When Lauren played the recordings, all 6 of them, from Derek's initial probing to Victoria's casual discussion of murder, the attorney's face hardened into something that looked like controlled rage, tempered by professional discipline. After the final recording faded, Rourke removed her glasses and set down her pen with deliberate care, as though she needed the physical action to center herself before speaking. When she finally met Lauren's eyes, her voice carried the weight of someone delivering news that would change lives. "Mrs. Ashford, I need you to understand something with absolute clarity. If these recordings are authentic, and I'll need forensic audio analysis to verify they haven't been digitally manipulated, we're not dealing with a simple inheritance dispute. We're dealing with first-degree murder conspiracy, solicitation of murder, tampering with a motor vehicle resulting in death, fraud in insurance documents, and attempted theft of assets from minor children. This is criminal. Derek and Victoria Hargrave are facing life in prison if we can prove what's on these recordings." Lauren's throat was too tight to speak, but she managed to nod, and Rourke continued with the kind of focused intensity that made it clear she was already building the case in her mind. "Can we prove it? Yes. Can we protect your children? Yes. But you need to understand what you're walking into. The moment we move forward with this, the Hargraves will come at you with everything they have. They have money, connections, expensive lawyers who know every trick in the book. They'll try to destroy your credibility, claim you forged the recordings, paint you as an unfit mother trying to steal money that doesn't belong to you. They'll fight dirty because they're facing murder charges, and people facing life in prison will do anything to avoid that fate." She leaned forward, her gaze locked on Lauren's with an intensity that demanded truth. "Are you ready for that fight? Because once we start this, there's no going back. It ends with either complete victory or complete destruction. And there's very little middle ground." Lauren thought of Sophia asking why Grandma didn't love them anymore, thought of Nathan waking up screaming from nightmares about dark roads, thought of Ryan planning for his own death because he knew his family well enough to understand the danger they represented, thought of herself 3 weeks ago, walking through freezing darkness with everything she owned in a broken suitcase while the people who'd murdered her husband sat in their mansion congratulating themselves on a plan well executed. "They killed my husband. They threw my children into poverty. They called my babies worthless. Yes, I'm ready." Rourke's answering smile was sharp enough to cut. "Good, because we're about to go to war, and I don't intend to lose." The attorney spent the next 3 days building a case with the kind of methodical precision that made Lauren understand why Elspeth had sent her here. First came the forensic audio analysis, Rourke hiring a specialist named Dr. Marcus Webb, who'd spent 40 years working for the FBI before retiring to private consulting. His report came back within 48 hours, dense with technical terminology about spectral analysis and voice pattern matching and background noise consistency. But the conclusion was clear and unambiguous. All 6 recordings are authentic and unaltered. These conversations actually occurred. This evidence will stand up in court.
Next came verification of the patent itself. Rourke contacting the United States Patent Office and requesting official documentation of patent number 8,945,673, its current status, its licensing agreements, and the chain of ownership from Walter Brennan to Ryan Ashford to the trust that named Lauren as primary beneficiary. The response confirmed everything in Ryan's documents and added detail that made the numbers even more staggering. 17 companies currently licensing the technology, annual royalty payments that had actually grown to $11.3 million in the most recent fiscal year, and a conservative 20-year valuation that put the total value closer to $226 million when accounting for projected growth in the renewable energy sector. Finally came the request to reopen Ryan's accident investigation. Rourke submitting a formal petition to the Montana State Police Major Crimes Unit, along with copies of the recordings and a detailed explanation of why what had been ruled mechanical failure needed to be examined as potential homicide. The detective assigned to review the case was a man named Jameson Vale, 47 years old, with the kind of weathered face that came from seeing too much of humanity's worst impulses. And his response was immediate and decisive. "I remember the Ashford accident from October," he told Rourke over the phone while Lauren listened on speaker. "Route 12, brake failure. Vehicle went off the cliff at the worst possible point on that descent. We ruled it mechanical because there was no obvious motive, and the initial examination suggested worn brake lines. But I had doubts even then. That truck was only 2 years old and had been recently serviced. Brakes don't just fail on newer vehicles that have been properly maintained." He ordered the immediate impounding of what remained of Ryan's Toyota Tacoma from the salvage yard where it had been sitting for 4 months. And 3 days later, his report landed on Rourke's desk with findings that transformed suspicion into certainty. The brake lines had not failed due to age or wear. They had been deliberately cut approximately 75% through with a precision tool, almost certainly wire cutters designed for automotive work. The cuts positioned and angled to fail under sustained pressure, exactly like the pressure created when descending a steep mountain grade while applying brakes repeatedly. This was sabotage. This was murder. And Detective Vale was already moving to the next phase of investigation, subpoenaing Derek Hargrave's phone records and bank statements for the month before Ryan's death. The records told a story even clearer than the recordings. On October 18th, Derek had withdrawn $50,000 cash from his personal account. The transaction recorded on an ATM receipt, time-stamped at 3:47 in the afternoon. That same day, his phone showed a 27-minute call to a number that traced back to Braxton Automotive Services, a small garage on the outskirts of Billings. 2 days later, Derek's phone had pinged off a cell tower near that same garage at 12:30 in the afternoon, lunchtime, when the shop would have been closed and the owner would have been away. Security camera footage from a business across the street showed Derek's black Mercedes parked near Braxton's for 31 minutes during that lunch hour. And Detective Vale's investigation revealed that Ryan had brought his truck in for routine maintenance at Braxton's on October 21st, just 2 days before his death. The service report showed that the owner, a man named Colton Ryder, had inspected the brakes and signed off that they'd passed with no issues. 2 days later, those same brakes had failed catastrophically on Route 12, sending Ryan's truck over a cliff and killing him instantly when it struck the rocks 200 feet below. Detective Vale brought Colton Ryder in for questioning and offered him a deal that was as simple as it was devastating. Full immunity from prosecution in exchange for complete cooperation and truthful testimony about what Derek Hargrave had paid him to do. Colton, 39 years old, with 2 kids and a conscience that apparently hadn't let him sleep soundly since October, broke down within the first hour of interrogation and confessed everything. Derek had approached him 3 weeks before the accident, had explained that he needed his cousin's truck adjusted in a way that would cause brake failure on a mountain descent while looking like natural wear rather than deliberate sabotage, had paid $50,000 cash, with $25,000 up front and $25,000 after the job was done. Had shown him a photograph of Ryan's truck and told him the vehicle would be coming in for service on October 21st. Colton had done exactly what he'd been paid to do. Had cut the brake lines 75% through, leaving just enough intact that the truck would seem fine under normal driving conditions, but would fail under the sustained pressure of a long downhill drive.
Had signed off on the inspection report, claiming the brakes were perfect. Had collected his blood money and tried to tell himself he was just following orders, that what happened after the truck left his shop wasn't his responsibility, that $50,000 was more than he made in 2 years, and his family needed it. But he'd watched the news that night when Ryan's death was reported, had seen Lauren at the funeral on television, holding her children while they lowered her husband into the ground. Had nightmares every single night since then, dreams where Ryan Ashford stood in his garage asking why, asking how someone could do that for money, asking if Colton's soul was worth $50,000. The confession was recorded and witnessed and signed, and Detective Vale filed for arrest warrants the same day.
They came for Derek and Victoria on a gray March morning, exactly 1 week after Lauren had opened the safety deposit box in the Billings vault. Lauren wasn't there to see it happen. Rourke had advised against being anywhere near the Hargrave estate when the arrests went down, but Detective Vale described it to her later with the kind of grim satisfaction that came from finally getting justice for a victim who couldn't speak for himself.
Derek had been in his study going over financial documents, apparently trying to liquidate assets before the inevitable freeze that would come when the criminal investigation became public knowledge. He'd looked up when the police entered, and his face had gone absolutely white, all the entitled confidence draining away, as Detective Vale read him his rights and placed him under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation of murder, and tampering with a motor vehicle resulting in death. Combined maximum sentence: life in prison without possibility of parole. Victoria had been in the sitting room sipping tea as though nothing in her perfectly ordered world had changed, as though she hadn't conspired to murder her own nephew for money. She tried to bluster, tried to pull rank and invoke connections and threaten lawsuits, but the handcuffs had gone on anyway, and her protests had faded into shocked silence as she was led out of the mansion she'd ruled like a fiefdom for decades. Both were denied bail, Judge Richardson ruling that they represented flight risks given their substantial financial resources and that they potentially posed danger to witnesses, specifically Lauren and the twins. The perp walks were broadcast on every local news station. Images of Victoria and Derek Hargrave being led from their estate in handcuffs, their faces caught by dozens of cameras. No longer wealthy and powerful and untouchable, but just 2 frightened criminals facing the consequences of their greed. The custody hearing was scheduled for March 8th, 5 days after the arrests, and Lauren sat in Rourke Sterling's office going over strategy while Sophia and Nathan played quietly in the reception area under the watchful eye of Rourke's paralegal. The Hargraves had filed their emergency custody motion 3 days before their arrest, and despite everything that had happened since, the court had decided to proceed with the hearing rather than dismiss it outright. Judge Richardson wanted to hear all the evidence in one consolidated proceeding, wanted to address both the custody claims and the criminal charges in a way that would protect the children's interests while ensuring justice was served. Rourke spread documents across her desk in careful arrangement, building a visual representation of the case they would present. Trust documents proving the $100 million motive. Ryan's letter showing he'd anticipated the danger. Forensic audio reports confirming the recordings were authentic. Detective Vale's investigation findings about the sabotaged brake lines. Colton Ryder's signed confession describing exactly how Derek had paid him to murder Ryan. Every piece of evidence meticulously organized and ready to destroy the Hargraves' claims that they were concerned grandparents trying to rescue children from an unfit mother.
"They're going to paint you as desperate and unstable," Rourke explained, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd fought these battles before. "They'll point to your poverty, your minimum wage job, the fact that you're living in a friend's one-bedroom apartment. They'll claim that proves you can't provide for Sophia and Nathan, that the children deserve the stability and resources only the Hargrave family can offer. What they won't expect is that we're not defending against custody claims. We're prosecuting them for murder." The courtroom on the morning of March 8th was packed with media and spectators drawn by a story that had everything: wealth, murder, orphan children, and a mother fighting against impossible odds. Lauren wore the best outfit she'd been able to assemble from the thrift store, a navy dress that was slightly too large and shoes that pinched but looked professional enough. Across the aisle sat Victoria and Derek, in expensive suits that couldn't quite hide the orange jumpsuits they'd been wearing in county lockup, flanked by their attorney, Silas Whitmore, and looking like people who'd finally begun to understand that money might not save them this time. Judge Richardson was exactly what Lauren had hoped for. A man in his late 60s with white hair and sharp eyes that suggested he'd seen every variation of human ugliness and wasn't easily fooled by expensive lawyers or social standing. He reviewed the motions before him with careful attention, occasionally glancing up to assess the players in this drama. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who took his responsibility seriously. "We're here to address an emergency custody motion filed by Victoria and Derek Hargrave, seeking removal of minor children Sophia and Nathan Ashford from their mother's care. However, given recent developments in a related criminal investigation, this hearing will also address evidence relevant to charges of conspiracy to commit murder and other serious crimes. Mr. Whitmore, you may proceed with your opening statement." Whitmore stood and launched into a presentation clearly designed to tug at heartstrings and obscure facts behind emotional appeals. He painted a picture of devoted grandparents who had only recently learned their beloved grandchildren were living in squalor, presented glossy photographs of the Hargrave estate with its manicured grounds and spacious rooms, showed brochures from elite private schools where Sophia and Nathan could receive the finest education money could buy. He described Lauren's living situation in damning detail. The single bedroom shared by mother and two children in someone else's apartment, the minimum wage job stocking shelves at night, the complete absence of family support or financial resources. "Your Honor, my clients recognize that Mrs. Ashford has faced difficult circumstances since the tragic death of her husband. But difficult circumstances don't change the fundamental question before this court. What is in the best interests of these children? They are Hargraves by blood, entitled to the advantages and opportunities that family connection provides. Mrs. Ashford, despite her undoubtedly good intentions, simply cannot provide the stability and resources these children deserve. My clients offer them a home, education, security, everything a loving family should provide." He sat down looking satisfied, and Lauren felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach, despite knowing what evidence Rourke was about to unleash. Because Whitmore was right about one thing. On paper, she looked exactly like an unfit mother who should lose her children to wealthy relatives who could give them everything she couldn't. Rourke stood and spent the first 10 minutes methodically dismantling Whitmore's emotional appeal with cold facts. She presented evidence that Lauren was employed and self-supporting, that the children were healthy and well cared for, according to their pediatrician's reports, that their living situation, while modest, was clean
and safe and temporary. She called Maeve Calloway to testify about providing housing and support, not out of pity, but out of friendship. About watching Lauren work herself to exhaustion every night to provide for her children. About Sophia and Nathan being happy and well-adjusted despite the trauma of losing their father. But then Rourke shifted gears, and the entire atmosphere in the courtroom changed as she presented the trust documents for the first time in open court. Your Honor, Mrs.
Ashford's poverty is not the result of inability or incompetence. It's the result of deliberate action by the very people now claiming to be concerned about her children's welfare. 4 months ago, Ryan Ashford inherited a patent worth conservatively $100 million. He created an irrevocable trust naming his wife and children as sole beneficiaries and specifically excluding any member of the Hargrave family. When Victoria and Derek Hargrave learned of this inheritance, they didn't celebrate their nephew's good fortune. They murdered him for it. The gallery erupted in gasps and whispered exclamations, and Judge Richardson's gavel came down sharply to restore order. Whitmore was on his feet objecting, claiming these accusations were inflammatory and unsupported by evidence. But Rourke simply pulled out Dr. Webb's forensic analysis report and asked permission to play the recordings Ryan had made in the weeks before his death. The judge nodded, his expression grave, and the courtroom fell silent as Derek's voice filled the space through the audio system, smooth and friendly on the surface while probing for information about Walter's patents and licensing agreements. Then Victoria's imperious demands that Ryan acknowledge his obligation to share family assets. Then Derek again, more aggressive this time, threatening consequences for those who didn't cooperate with family interests. The fourth recording hit like a bomb. Victoria and Derek's private conversation about forcing Ryan's hand or finding a more permanent solution. Their casual discussion of brake failures and tragic accidents, and the plan to destroy Lauren afterward, to take the children and the money and leave her with nothing. Someone in the gallery actually cried out when Victoria's cold voice stated with perfect clarity that when Ryan was gone, they would make sure that wife of his got absolutely nothing, that they would claim the marriage was fraudulent and the children illegitimate, and contest every legal protection Ryan had tried to put in place. The fifth recording captured Derek arranging the actual murder. His voice matter-of-fact as he told someone the car needed to be prepared. The brake line needed to fail on the mountain road. $50,000 cash for a job that would look like mechanical failure rather than deliberate sabotage. And the sixth recording was Victoria laying out their complete plan, describing in detail how they would use litigation and custody threats and Lauren's poverty against her, how they would bury her in legal bills and intimidation until she gave up and let them have the children and the money that came with them. When the final recording ended, the silence in the courtroom was absolute and terrible. Judge Richardson's face had gone from merely grave to something approaching controlled fury. And when he looked at Victoria and Derek now, it was with eyes that saw them for exactly what they were. Murderers who'd killed their own nephew and then tried to steal from his orphaned children. Whitmore attempted to argue that the recordings were fabricated, that modern technology made audio manipulation easy, that this was all part of Lauren's elaborate fraud to steal money she had no legitimate claim to. But Rourke calmly presented Dr. Webb's analysis report, 3 independent experts confirming the recordings were authentic and unaltered, complete with technical data about voice pattern matching and background noise consistency, and digital signatures that proved these conversations had actually occurred. Then came Detective Vale's testimony, delivered with the flat, professional tone of someone reciting facts rather than opinions. He described the initial accident investigation, the ruling of mechanical failure, his own doubts even at the time about brake lines failing on a 2-year-old truck with recent service. He detailed the forensic examination of the vehicle that showed deliberate cutting rather than natural wear. The precise 75% cuts positioned to fail under sustained braking pressure. He presented Derek's phone records showing the cash withdrawal and the calls to Braxton Automotive, and the cell tower data proving he'd been at the garage during lunch hour when the shop was closed. And then came Colton Ryder, looking 10 years older than his 39 years, his hands shaking as he described exactly what Derek had paid him to do and how he'd done it, and how he'd signed off on a brake inspection he knew was fraudulent. His voice broke when he talked about seeing Lauren and the children on television at Ryan's funeral, about the nightmares that had plagued him ever since, about knowing he'd taken money to murder a man who'd never done anything to him except bring his truck in for routine service. I knew it was wrong. I knew someone would die. But $50,000. His voice failed completely for a moment before he forced himself to continue. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility what happened after the truck left my shop. But it was. I killed Ryan Ashford as surely as if I'd pushed him off that cliff myself. And I have to live with that for the rest of my life. The testimony devastated whatever remained of the Hargraves position, but Derek himself delivered the final blow when he lost control completely. He'd been sitting rigid in his chair throughout the proceedings, his face growing progressively paler as each piece of evidence destroyed his defense. And when Colton finished testifying, Derek suddenly stood up and started shouting across the courtroom at Lauren. "You have no right to that money. It belongs to the Hargrave family. Ryan was my cousin. Walter was my great-uncle. That patent came from my family's legacy. You're nothing but a gold-digging." The bailiff moved to restrain him, but Derek kept shouting, all his careful control shattered by the realization that he was actually going to prison, that the plan he and Victoria had executed with such confidence had failed catastrophically, that instead of securing $100 million, he'd destroyed his own life. It was supposed to be an accident. Just brake failure, that's all. He wasn't supposed to. The truck wasn't supposed to go over the cliff like that. It was just supposed to scare him into cooperating. A full confession, delivered in open court in front of a judge and jury and dozens of witnesses. And the moment Derek realized what he'd done, his face went absolutely white, and he collapsed back into his chair as though his legs had given out. Judge Richardson's gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot, and his voice when he spoke carried the kind of cold fury that comes from witnessing evil try to wrap itself in the language of family and concern. I am denying the Hargrave custody petition in its entirety. Furthermore, I am issuing an immediate restraining order preventing Victoria Hargrave and Derek Hargrave from coming within 500 feet of Lauren Ashford or her minor children, Sophia Rose Ashford and Nathan Ryan Ashford. Mrs. Ashford will retain full custody of her children, and I am referring this matter to the district attorney for immediate prosecution of murder charges. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down again with absolute finality, and Lauren felt her knees go weak with relief so profound it was almost painful. Rourke's hand on her shoulder kept her upright, and behind them in the gallery she could hear people crying and talking in shocked voices about what they'd just witnessed. Across the aisle, Victoria sat frozen in her chair, staring at nothing, while Derek was being led away by deputies. And Silas Whitmore gathered his papers with the mechanical movements of someone who knew his career had just ended, along with his client's freedom. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Lauren finally reunited with Sophia and Nathan, who'd been kept in a separate waiting room during the testimony. They ran to her with arms outstretched, and she knelt to gather them close, breathing in the familiar scent of their hair, while tears streamed down her face. "Mommy, are we going home?" Sophia asked, her blue eyes searching Lauren's face for reassurance. "Yes, baby, we're going home."
and nobody is ever going to take you away from me again." The criminal trial proceeded with the kind of grim inevitability that came from having overwhelming evidence and a defendant who'd confessed in open court. The district attorney charged Derek with conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation of murder, and tampering with a motor vehicle resulting in death. Charges that combined carried a maximum sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. Victoria faced charges as accessory after the fact, conspiracy to defraud, and attempted kidnapping. Enough to put her away for 40 years if convicted on all counts. The jury deliberated for 4 hours in late June before returning guilty verdicts on every charge. Derek got life without parole, his face completely blank as the sentence was read, all the entitled fury drained away, leaving only the empty shell of a man who'd destroyed himself chasing money he'd never had any right to. Victoria got 35 years, which at 63 was effectively a life sentence, and she wept as the deputies led her away. But whether from remorse or self-pity was impossible to tell. The patent claim proceeded through a separate legal process, Rourke filing to formalize Lauren's ownership of the trust and notify all 17 licensing companies that future royalty payments should be directed to new accounts under Lauren's control. The companies cooperated immediately, none of them wanting any association with a patent that had motivated murder. And within 6 weeks, the first royalty check arrived. $943,000 for 1 month's licensing fees. Lauren stared at the check for a long time before depositing it, the number so large it seemed to belong to someone else's life rather than hers. She'd gone from desperate poverty to nearly $1 million in the space of weeks, and the whiplash of that transition was almost harder to process than the poverty had been. But she'd had 4 months of being hungry and desperate and terrified to teach her exactly what money could and couldn't do. And that education shaped every decision she made with the fortune Ryan had died protecting. The first priority was Maeve, who tried to refuse with the same fierce energy she'd shown that first night when Lauren had called begging for help. But Lauren was equally fierce in her insistence, and they finally compromised on Lauren paying off Maeve's $18,000 in credit card debt and buying her a 3-bedroom house on a quiet street with a yard and a garden, where Maeve could finally stop working herself to exhaustion. "You gave me shelter when I had nothing. You fed my children when I couldn't. You stood with me when the whole world seemed determined to destroy us. This isn't charity, Maeve. This is family taking care of family." Maeve cried and hugged her and eventually accepted the house because she was too exhausted to keep fighting, and because deep down, she knew she deserved it for what she'd sacrificed. The second priority was establishing trust funds for Sophia and Nathan. $10 million each in accounts they couldn't touch until age 25, but that would ensure their futures, regardless of what happened to Lauren or the patent royalties. Rourke helped structure them with the kind of careful legal protections that meant no court and no relative and no future disaster could take away what Ryan had meant for his children to have. The third decision was the one that felt most important, most true to the man Ryan had been, and the legacy Walter had intended. Lauren established the Walter Brennan Foundation for Renewable Energy Innovation with an initial endowment of $50 million, dedicated to supporting inventors and engineers who couldn't afford patent attorneys or had revolutionary ideas but no resources to develop them. The foundation would do for others what Walter's hidden patent had done for Lauren: provide security and opportunity and the chance to change the world without being destroyed by people who valued money over innovation. Hazel Winters received $500,000 and cried when Lauren showed up at the Stone Mill diner to deliver the check personally, insisting she couldn't possibly accept that much money for one night of kindness. But Lauren reminded her that Hazel had said kindness wasn't a debt. It was a gift that kept moving.
And this was simply the gift moving forward to help other desperate people who walked into the diner at midnight with nowhere else to go. 20 million went to a community fund for Clearwater, specifically earmarked to help families who'd been displaced by Victoria's development company over the years, to repair the damage she'd caused through gentrification and predatory business practices. Detective Vale helped identify the families who'd suffered most, and watching them receive checks that would let them buy back homes or start businesses or simply breathe without constant financial terror made Lauren feel like she was honoring what Ryan would have wanted. The rest, and there was a staggering amount of rest given that the royalty checks kept coming every month, Lauren invested conservatively with the help of financial advisors who Rourke vetted carefully. She didn't want mansions or luxury cars or the trappings of wealth that had made the Hargraves into monsters. She wanted security, wanted to know her children would never be thrown out into the cold, wanted to help others the way she'd been helped. 1 year after opening the safety deposit box in Billings, Lauren purchased a comfortable 4-bedroom house in Missoula. Not a mansion, but a home with a yard where Sophia and Nathan could play, and a neighborhood with good schools and families who didn't care about patents or fortunes. Maeve lived 3 blocks away, close enough to be family, but far enough to have her own life now that she'd quit the exhausting hospital job and was working normal hours as a school nurse. Lauren also purchased Walter Brennan's old estate in Clearwater, the property Ryan had inherited but never had a chance to see. The Victorian mansion had been abandoned for 40 years, slowly deteriorating while Victoria tried unsuccessfully to acquire it through legal challenges. With the criminal convictions, all Victoria's claims had evaporated, and the estate passed to Lauren as Ryan's heir. The restoration project took 18 months and cost $7 million. Lauren hired the best craftspeople in Montana to restore the 1924 structure to its former glory while integrating modern systems seamlessly. The house became the Walter Brennan Center for Renewable Energy Innovation, a museum showcasing Walter's original patent and prototype, classrooms where high school students could learn about renewable energy, and laboratories funded by the foundation where the next generation of engineers could develop their own world-changing ideas. The grand opening in July drew hundreds of people. Licensing company representatives, Montana's governor, clean energy advocates, reporters from national outlets. Lauren gave a speech on the mansion's front steps, her voice steady as she looked out at the crowd. 1 year ago, I stood in a storage room with my children, broke and grieving and convinced the world had abandoned us. Today we stand here because one man had vision, because another man had courage, and because a community chose kindness over indifference. Walter Brennan invented technology that will power millions of homes with clean energy. Ryan Ashford died protecting that invention, so it could benefit humanity rather than enrich those who already had more than they needed. This center exists to honor both of them, and to ensure that innovation serves the future rather than the past. The ribbon was cut, the doors opened, and Sophia and Nathan gave tours to visitors, their voices serious as they explained about their great-great-grandfather Walter and their daddy Ryan, and why renewable energy mattered for the planet's future. 2 years after the trial, Lauren received a letter from the Women's Correctional Facility where Victoria was serving her sentence. The envelope sat on her desk for a week before she could bring herself to open it. Mrs. Ashford, I am writing to inform you that I have sold what remained of Hargrave Industries and donated the proceeds, $45 million, to renewable energy research as directed by the court-ordered restitution. I cannot undo what Derek and I did to your husband and your family. I cannot repair the damage or restore what was taken, but I have spent 2 years in this place, thinking about the choices I made and the person I became. And I understand now that wealth without conscience is worse than poverty with dignity.
I do not ask for forgiveness because I do not deserve it. I ask only that you know I am sorry, inadequate as those words are. Victoria Hargrave. Lauren read the letter twice and then filed it away without responding. Some wounds were too deep for letters to heal, and some apologies came too late to matter.
But 3 months later, when Victoria's attorney contacted Lauren about a request to see photographs of Sophia and Nathan, not to have contact, just to see how they were growing, Lauren surprised herself by agreeing. She sent a single photo taken at the center's opening, showing the twins standing in front of Walter's patent display with smiles that proved they'd survived their trauma and were thriving.
She included no note, no message, nothing but that one image that said everything. These children are fine without you. Derek never reached out to Lauren, never asked for anything. Simply disappeared into the prison system to serve his life sentence in silence. But Detective Vale mentioned that Derek had requested transfer to the prison library, where he spent his days reading engineering textbooks and patent law, as though trying to understand the technology he'd killed for, as though knowledge acquired too late could somehow absolve him of murder. 5 years after the trial, Lauren received a call informing her that Victoria Hargrave had died of a heart attack during the night, peaceful in her sleep at age 68, 5 years into her 35-year sentence. Lauren felt nothing at the news except a vague sense of completion, the final chapter of a story that had stopped mattering to her daily life. She didn't attend the funeral, didn't send flowers, didn't acknowledge Victoria's death in any way beyond filing the notification with all the other documents that recorded the destruction of the Hargrave family. The Walter Brennan Center thrived, becoming known nationally as a model for renewable energy education. The foundation funded 47 new projects in its first 5 years, supporting inventors who might have been the next Walter Brennan if only they'd had resources and legal protection. Sophia showed signs of following in Walter and Ryan's engineering footsteps, her room filling with science kits and robotics projects. Nathan gravitated toward history and writing, already talking about documenting the full story of Walter's invention and Ryan's sacrifice. Lauren let them grow at their own pace, supporting their interests without pushing, making sure they knew they were loved not for what they might accomplish, but for who they already were. On the anniversary of Ryan's death each year, Lauren would drive out to the Clearwater Cemetery and spend an hour sitting by his headstone, updating him on everything that had happened. She told him about Sophia's latest science fair victory, and Nathan's emerging talent for storytelling, and the Foundation's new projects, and all the ways his sacrifice had mattered. She told him that she'd kept her promise, that she'd protected their children, that she'd fought the monsters who'd taken him away and won not just in court, but in the larger battle of ensuring his death meant something beyond tragedy. And then she would drive home to the life they'd built together and lost too soon, and that she'd somehow managed to rebuild from ruins. 7 years after that freezing November night when Victoria's gates had slammed shut, Lauren sat on her front porch on a warm summer evening, watching Sophia and Nathan play in the yard. They were 11 now, healthy and happy, and secure in ways that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with being loved unconditionally. Maeve walked over from her house 3 blocks away, carrying lemonade and settling into the chair beside Lauren with the comfortable ease of family. "Beautiful evening," Maeve said. "It is." They sat in companionable silence, watching the children, listening to their laughter carry on the warm breeze. The Montana mountains rose in the distance, painted gold and rose by the setting sun. The same wilderness where Ryan had died, and where Lauren had learned that sometimes the greatest treasures were measured not in dollars, but in the love that endured long after the lover was gone. Sophia ran up to the porch, breathless and grinning. "Mom, Can we go to the center tomorrow? I want to show Nathan the new solar panel display. Of course, baby.
Nathan joined his sister, both of them sun-flushed and happy, and Lauren pulled them close for a moment, breathing in the scent of grass and summer and childhood.
We love you, Mom, Sophia said simply. I love you too. Both of you. More than anything in this world.
They ran back to their game, and Lauren watched them go. These children who'd survived the worst and emerged stronger for it, who would grow up knowing their father had been a hero and their mother had been brave enough to fight for what mattered. The sun touched the mountain peaks, and Lauren thought about the journey from desperation to peace, from $20 to security, from grief to purpose. The path had been paved with kindness from strangers and courage in the face of evil, and the refusal to let cruelty have the final word. Ryan's legacy wasn't measured in patents or dollars, but in the lives touched by the foundation, and the children raised with love, and the proof that ordinary people could defeat monsters if they refused to surrender. And that, Lauren thought, as the last light faded from the sky, was the only legacy that truly mattered.